Yeah, hello, good afternoon. Is someone speaking?
Yes, ma'am. My question was that today is going to be interaction with the teacher, and
Yeah, yeah.
tomorrow will be revision session. Will there be a solve with us instructor for week 4, week 5 ever?
Yeah, we replace that session with this only.
Okay.
Yeah. So we have a faculty with us, so you can ask whatever you want.
Yeah, hi. Trivikram, see, the thing is, the Solve with Instructor session for week 5 has been scheduled in the coming week. Okay, so will also be integrating it with the database thing, right? So it will be a larger session comprising of two coming sessions. Okay, given that. We have quiz on Sunday, right? So this is the right time that we you all can interact with the faculty of this course and then ask. So what happens is when the faculty comes in, the spectrum of doubt increases, right? So you can ask doubts related to other parts also, not other part as in the other things related to the course. All right. Yeah. So that was the agenda today. So what we'll do is we'll go through so we'll try to present you some slides, giving you a certain idea of how all these 4 weeks went off. Okay. And then we'll talk on something. So if you all have doubts, they are all welcome. And so we also have our faculty present here. Good afternoon, sir. Are you there? Hello.
Yes, Adarsh, I think Nitin sir is some
Yeah,
network
yeah.
issue.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So what we'll be doing is we have created a short presentation where we'll be highlighting all those topics which were covered for each week, and then it will be also a pointer to you all to get into some topics and ask your specific doubts. Okay. I'll be sharing this screen, and we'll have our faculty getting into the content. All right. Yeah. So we'll start once he's available. Hello. Hello, am I audible, Sonal?
Yeah, yeah, you are audible.
Sir, can you hear me?
Hello, everyone. Am I audible? Others or
Yes, sir.
Sonal?
Now you're audible.
Yeah, thank you. I think there was some problem with my headphones.
Okay, all right. Yeah, so I'll share the screen and then we
Yes,
can
sounds good. Thanks, Adarsh. Good afternoon.
The screen is visible, right?
Yeah, it's good. Yeah.
Okay, fine.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this live session for modern application development. This is just a general live session. No specific agenda. I just wanted to sort of quickly recap what we have. But since this is the first time I'm also interacting with people in this session of application development one, feel free to basically go ahead and ask any questions, and let's keep it interactive as far as possible. Okay. So I'll be turning off my video. I think there's some background lighting, which probably isn't ideal for a video setting, but just walk through a couple of slides. This is just sort of a quick recap of what was done in the first 4 weeks, and is basically therefore due for the quiz as well. Okay. So yeah, Adarsh, can you go to the next slide? Yeah. So, first things first, of course, you have been through 4 weeks of the course now. So, by this point, you should have gotten a rough idea of the manner in which we are conducting the course, right? And what I mean by that is the approach that we took over here for a very specific reason was, rather than picking up one, the latest and greatest technology and saying, oh, we will teach you how to use React or Ruby on Rails. Of course, Ruby on Rails is not the latest and greatest, but whatever is the flavor of the day, right? What we felt was, instead of that, we wanted to try and focus on certain concepts with the hope that no matter which language or which framework you finally end up using, the basic ideas that we are looking at in this course should be of use to you. Okay. So that was the sense in which, we started off basically by looking at the basics of the web itself. What does the web mean, right? Because there's a lot of talk nowadays, especially you would have heard of things like Web3, right? Which presumably means that right now we are in Web 2. Okay. But to really understand what the web is all about, you need to go all the way back to Web 1, which is just the HTTP protocol and HTML, right? That was the core idea behind what essentially developed into the web, right? You had this idea of a protocol whereby you could transfer data. You could essentially set up servers very easily, right? And those servers would get requests from clients in a simple sort of text-based format, and they would be able to respond. And of course, where Web 2 basically took off was when it started adding server functionality, which means that rather than just sort of sending static pages, the servers would be able to look at requests from the clients and seriously start changing the way that they respond in various ways, right? And as a result, of course, nowadays the web as it stands is pretty much the biggest platform available for applications in general, right? Things that where you want to reach out to multiple users. Okay? So we started off with a lot of talk about software architectures, design patterns, and the basics of protocols and the web and so on, right? And then started getting into the sort of core concepts that we wanted to review in terms of what is the main thing required for the course, right? And over there, essentially what we said was, there is the front end, right, which is basically basics of HTML. HTML by itself is purely what's called semantic markup. And what we mean by semantic markup is it just sort of tells you that different parts of text, right, have specific meanings. So for example, I could tag something and say this is a heading, tag something else, say it's a paragraph, and so on, right? And it doesn't really say anything about how it should be displayed on screen, right? And if you really go back and look at old browsers, right, I mean, this is from the mid 90s and so on, you would find that one browser to another, even how it displays a heading would be different. Okay. It's only nowadays that we find that Chrome, Firefox, Edge, Safari all pretty much have very similar kinds of outputs by default, right? But that was not what HTML said fundamentally. So nowadays, of course, CSS, right, the style sheets are the basic way in which styling is done. That is to say, you represent what you want your output to look like, right? So you sort of separate out the semantics, the meaning of your text from the presentation, how it should be displayed, right? And of course, once again, there are a lot of technical details over here. What kind of tags, what kind of styling, selectors, precedence, responsive design, right? A lot of things which were covered, some of them in the videos, some of them in the screencast, and some in the live sessions, right? The interaction with the instructors. So that's basically what week 1 and week 2. Can we switch to week 3? Yeah. So at that point, what we got into was we started looking at basically the V and the M of MVC, right? Now, MVC by itself is an interesting concept. Okay, it's a very useful concept in terms of how you structure your system. Okay, and that is the way that you need to think about it, right? It's not that MVC is, oh, you need to do things in one particular way, or if you don't do this, it's not MVC, or if you don't use MVC, somehow it's wrong, right? At the end of the day, whether you use whether you can actually clearly separate something out and say, oh, this is the model, this is the view, this is the controller, is not really anybody's concern, right? Beyond the point. Where that becomes useful is, does this abstraction of thinking of a system in terms of a model and a view and the controller that sort of exchanges information between the two, is that a useful way of looking at a system in terms of how you would go about designing it, debugging it, enhancing functionality, and so on? Okay. So with that, week 3 essentially covered the presentation layer, right? Views, right? Different ways by which you can generate HTML. Of course, you can hand code it, right? Write the entire HTML out, but you obviously can't do that when you want to have a dynamic application, right? And so we looked at programmatic HTML generation, but more importantly is templates, right? What do templates mean? How do they work? What are different examples of templates, and how can you use them basically, right, to systematically generate output that would describe whatever your screen wants to look like. And in week 4, we looked at models, right? Now, most of you hopefully have either already done or are currently doing something, a course on databases, which means that a large part of week 4 would be sort of a recap to some extent of things that you have, that you should already be familiar with, right? In particular, in this course, we don't go deep into databases. We look at them conceptually, right? Okay, what are relational databases? What are unstructured databases, right? We call them NoSQL, right? Some people sort of think of it as saying this is not SQL, but that's not the case. In general, what people like to think of it is this is not only SQL. You can actually go beyond that by sort of loosening the constraints on the database. You can allow additional types of queries to be put onto the system, right? So all of those we looked at purely at a sort of conceptual level. We didn't go into details of how relational databases are designed, how they are implemented, why they are efficient. Those kind of things we sort of took it for granted, right? And the main thing that we wanted to focus on was, what are relations, right? How do you express relations between different parts of systems? And as one of those things was essentially this concept called the ER diagram, which once again is useful in terms of understanding how different entities are related to each other. Okay. And one general word that I would like to put in over here is things like ER diagrams, MVC paradigm, flowcharts, right? All of these are useful concepts as long as you understand that they are tools to help you with understanding something, right? But the moment you get very sort of try to say, okay, this particular thing cannot be expressed properly, or this particular thing is a error in the way it is being expressed, you need to think about it. Is that error actually leading to confusion in the designer's mind about what needs to be implemented or how it can be implemented? If so, it needs to be fixed. But if not, if it turns out that this is fairly obvious, right, that this is pretty much the only way that this could be interpreted, then that's where the utility of these tools stops. you should not sort of be overly reliant on them. You need to think of them as tools that help you to understand your design rather than being an end in itself, right? It's not that you want to design an ER diagram because somebody told you to design an ER diagram. You want to design an ER diagram because that helps you to understand the relationships between the entities in your model, and therefore to build up a good architecture for your system. Okay, so this is basically the first 4 weeks. Of course, the fifth week is also halfway done right at this point, but I'm not really planning to discuss that at the moment, simply because the quiz is coming up in another couple of days, and that's primarily based on week 1 to 4, right? Once we are clear with anything related to week 1 to 4, if there are further questions on anything to do with the course, right, you are welcome to bring them. Okay, so in other words, I would probably give priority for questions that have direct impact on the course, but otherwise, you are free to ask anything. So that's basically it as far as the summary is concerned from my side. Any questions are welcome.
Good afternoon, sir.
Yeah, good afternoon.
Sir, so we in this model view controller, I just want to give an analogy. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Just want to clarify my concept. So here in our one of the assignments, we have got a data file in a CSV. So that is essentially the model in a way, because that's the database. And the Python code that we have written is the controller, and the view is finally the HTML page that we are getting. Is this correct? Is this analogy?
Close. I mean, the one difference I would say is the CSV file by itself is only storage.
Okay.
Right. Just like a MySQL database by itself is not a model. A MySQL database is only the way that you store the model. Right. The model is an abstract concept which is actually held inside the Python.
Okay.
Okay. So usually what will happen is you will have some classes or something which you use in order to define some objects, right? Whether it's a user or a course or whatever it is, right? You would have those classes, and actually speaking, the class is what you need to think of as the model. A model, in other words, is an abstract entity. You can't sort of point at something and say, okay, this is the model or that is the model. A model is an abstraction.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
The CSV file or the MySQL database are the way that you could store that data corresponding to the model. Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So apart from that, yeah, your analogy is broadly correct. I mean, in the sense that, once again, see, if you look at it, the Python code by itself pretty much contains some aspect of all three. Like I said, it already, it should contain some part of the model, right? And it of course has the controller, because the entire logic, in other words, what is being done, what messages are being sent between the view and the model, have to be sort of mediated through the controller. What about the view itself? Well, the view, like you said, is actually the HTML, but there is some part of the Python which is responsible for generating that HTML, the render template, if it is Jinja, or, PyHTML, or maybe even, just echoing out a string template or something like that. Okay. So in that sense, the Python will finally have like all aspects that you need. But apart from that, in terms of the overall structure, what you said is right.
Okay, sir.
Yeah.
Got it, sir.
So, like I mentioned it in some of those videos, but, as you go deeper into web app design, you'll find that MVC, nowadays, people sort of think of MVC as outdated, right? So there'll be people who say that, oh, you should think of other things. So in fact, in application development too, we are looking at this framework called Vue, which is used to render the front ends. And they sort of say that, they use something called a model view model, right? Now, what's the difference? You go look at it and, you have to break your head for quite a lot to find out what's the actual difference between a view model and a controller. And, why are we actually looking at these things differently, right? Now, that's exactly where I'm saying, don't get too stuck on which of these is the correct terminology to describe a particular design. Right? Model view controller is useful as long as it's in your head. Okay, it's useful for you to think about how to design your app. But if you sort of are very concerned about, should this be a MVC, or is this particular way of doing it correct? Does it violate any of the constraints of MVC? The question you should ask is, is it going to impact my final design, or is it going to, by making such a choice over here, am I going to make something wrong in my final design? As long as that is not the case and you are able to explain your design properly, that's pretty much where these models or the abstractions need to stop.
Got it. Got it. I think during the Web 1 and Web 2, this was very much used. But now, as we develop more and more higher programming languages, coding languages, these things are a little outdated.
No, that's what I'm saying. It's not that it's outdated. See, I mean, there's a reason I picked MVC, right? It's actually the oldest of these abstractions, right? MVC is there pretty much since 1979 or 1980 or something like that, right? I mean, well before most of you were, I guess, probably all of you were born, right? But the point is, there's a reason why it still remains as a useful concept, because it's a simple abstraction that allows you to think about how to design a system, right? Nowadays, there are a lot of abstractions, lots of different terms that come in. So, I would say that, in fact, I would sort of say the opposite of what you said. It's not that this is outdated. I would say that these are in some sense more core concepts than the distinctions that you find nowadays.
Got it.
Okay.
Got it.
Hello, sir.
Yes, go ahead.
Sir, I have a general kind of question that in practice assignment or graded assignment, there was a question like from the Jinja 2 that double curly braces open, then li which is a list, and then pipe length, and says what it does. Or something like that was the question. So it finds out the length of the list, right? But
Okay.
as for most of the things like HTML, CSS, we can find the tutorials and YouTube videos, and that those are very helpful. But for Jinja 2, there are less number of like resources. So we have to learn those concepts from the documentation. But when I go to the documentation, I find it very difficult to make out any intuition or make out any sense. Like for this example,
Yeah.
if I want to search that what are the other things, like there are so many other things in Python, like this is just find out the length, and for
Correct.
what about the other functions, how can I get all those things in once at a like page, right?
Yeah.
So these things I cannot find out. Can you put some tips like how should we like go through a documentation?
So, I mean, I agree with what you are saying in the sense that it's difficult to go through. I mean, sometimes the Jinja documentation, for example, is trying to explain the framework itself at a reasonably high level so that you can sort of understand what is going on. But exactly, I mean, how do you use, what kind of filters can be used? How do you write a filter? How do you create it? And so on, that you need to sort of, I guess, know where to look, right? Now, as part of that is what we are also trying to put together some of these things. As you know, there's a course wiki that we are creating. The issue over there is very often we don't know what are the right questions to be answered over there. And that's one part of it, right? So for example, now you have brought this up, it's definitely something for us to think about and say, okay, how can we expand on it? But the second part of the answer is, I mean, to a large extent, I mean, if you ask me, for example, I don't even know the answer to that. Okay. And the reason I'm saying that is, I mean, you might be wondering, okay, what's the instructor for the course saying? I don't know what the answer is. These are software and, frameworks that are changing at a rapid pace. Okay. So pretty much the only way that I would be able to keep track of this is to say, okay, as and when it comes up, there are two things I can do. One is, if I am aware of the fact that I can use filters and thereby, sort of write the code in a certain way, then I would probably look at, okay, how do I write better filters and go about doing it? But the alternative is, okay, can I get the same sort of behavior without using a filter? In other words, maybe I would write something in my Python code that actually computes it and outputs it directly to the Jinja. So in other words, take care of the computation in the Python. Now, I know that that's not really solving the problem that you have. I mean, there are some good uses for filters. Now, how exactly do you do it? I think what you mentioned, right, that you have to sometimes go back to the documentation, or in some of these cases, you even have to go one step further. You have to go back to the source. Okay. And that's not as hard as it sounds. Okay. Especially because Python is a language which is actually speaking reasonably readable for the most part. Okay. So if you want to go back one step and say, okay, I want to find out more about how this works, then you might even sort of look at, how do I go deeper into this and look at the source code and understand a bit more about how to use Jinja, right? But yes, I mean, I right now, all I can say is we'll definitely take this as feedback. I want to see if we can collect these kind of things and, put more information on it. One thing I would suggest as far as the course like this is concerned, the one resource that is available to you is the discourse, right? You bring it up on discourse. There are like people with a lot of experience over there who are looking at it, and they'll sort of be able to give you more inputs on how to use that. And we are finding that there's a lot of useful discussion. In fact, part of the idea of this course wiki is that we try and extract some of that into things that are more useful long term.
Yes, sir. So got it, sir. Actually, and for the length and other functions, I search in the Google, but I cannot find it inside the Jinja 2 documents. I mean directly, but just somehow managed a website from GitHub. There was a few such type of functions was listed.
Right. So, I mean, see, the problem is one thing I cannot guarantee is that we will be able to give you a full list of functions. Like I said, even those of us who have been coding for quite a while. So Tejesh, for example, has been coding for a long time with these kind of systems, but even he would not know exactly what the filters are. Now, having said that, if you look at the way that it is implemented, it even allows you to implement your own filters. Okay, so there is a way by which you can add your own filters, and actually length is just one of those things. It is also a Python program, right? A Python function which is written over there. So then you need to sort of look at how do Jinja filters work and add a bit more about that. I think that is possibly something we can try and address a little bit more clearly. We'll try and get some inputs on that.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. I will check that how to create our own filters.
Yeah. There's a question in the chat. If we consider the lab assignments, which approach is better? Should we process or filter the data first in Python and then send it, or should we send the entire data set and let Jinja do for calculating totals and average marks based on filter in our lab assignments? That's a good question, right? I mean, it's always a, tricky thing. Where should you draw the line, right? I mean, what should be the logic which is computed completely inside the Python code versus what is it that is part of the view, in other words, right? So there's no fixed answer to that, right? It's what you should probably do, right, when you are looking at designing a system like this is think about the data that you are trying to, and what is it that you are trying to do with the data, right? So there are two parts. One is, of course, there is some computational effort involved, right? Meaning that you actually have to calculate these things like totals and averages and so on, right? And the second part is some of it is being done in Python, whereas the other part is being done in Jinja, which means that you need to have the appropriate kind of filters and so on. Okay, so there's also which one is more efficient and which one is going to run faster. That's another question that you might have, right? So now when you come to this question, right, and you say, now the point is, as far as this particular application is concerned, in either case, it is being rendered on the server, right? Whether it is the Python code or it is the Jinja template, both of them are being handled at the server end, and only the final HTML will be sent to the browser. Okay, which means that you could pretty much draw the line in any place that you want. Right, it's probably easier to just do it in the Python and send the data to Jinja and use Jinja just to sort of interpolate the values in the correct places, right? So what's the drawback of that? You might have to send a lot of data from Python to Jinja, right? So probably the best way to do it is, create a class where you have computed all of these values and then send it across into Jinja, and Jinja just sort of picks out the appropriate values and displays them in the correct places. Right now, on the other hand, maybe you could even create a filter which you pass it an array, and it would basically, add up the values and find the mean value and so on, and put it in the correct place, right? Now, this question actually becomes a bit more relevant when you are looking at application development 2, where a lot of stuff is happening on the front end, right? So in Vue, for example, what you will be eventually seeing is that you probably actually only want to send the marks, and how it gets displayed, whether it is plotted, whether the average is displayed, whether it is totaled and displayed, all of that, those decisions are taken on the front end by JavaScript, which is running in the browser. Okay. So in other words, you need to think of it from the point of view of your application and say, what is it that I need to send? And what would be the benefits of either approach? And if you can't think of a strong case for doing it one way or the other, you're probably okay with whichever choice that you make. Yeah. So, okay, the next question in the chat used a flowchart for the MVC paradigm where controller connects the model connects the view connects the user, and again to the controller, like a directed cycle. Controller is a link between the model and the view. Yeah, see, that directed cycle, like I said, is something which is also slightly, let's think about what exactly it's doing, right? What we are trying to say over here is there is a model inside the which is part of your Python, and the model is stored inside the database, right? That is the actual sort of data that you are working with. Okay. And in some sense, that is the most important part, because if you don't have your data correct, then it's essentially, what are you doing with what is it that you're trying to display, or what is the app all about, right? The app is about the data. Okay. So the model in some sense is that most important part, because it contains the actual raw data that your system depends on. The view, on the other hand, is what the user is getting to see, right? And this is ultimately how they are interacting. Now, if you really look at it, right, there is something where what you're trying to do is, when I look at the view, which is what is there on my screen, how can I now interact with the server? I can either click on a link, or I can click on a button, or I can, enter some data into a form, and once again, click on a submit button or something like that. Okay. And that's the only way that the user can interact with the view. Okay. All right. But then what happens once I have interacted? I have either clicked on a link or I have done something else, right? Then the next thing that happens is when you click on that, some function, right, some Python code or something on the server side has to do some work. Okay, that essentially is the controller, because what it's doing is it's taking the input from the view, processing it in some way as required, right? Is this supposed to update the model? Is it supposed to just query the model? Is it supposed to, list out something about the model? Is it supposed to delete something inside the model? All of that information goes to the controller, and the controller finally takes care of interacting with the model. Now, that is the sense in which I mean that the controller is the link between the model and the view. Anything that comes from the view cannot go directly to the model. It has to go through an action. There is some sense of an action being performed, right? Either I want a list, or I want to add an item, or I want to delete an item, or I want to edit an item, right? All of those kind of things are actions that I want to perform on the data which is stored in the model. That is where the controller comes in. Now, of course, you might ask the question, all right, so you sent that action request to the model. Now, shouldn't the model be giving the data back to the controller and then it sends it back to the view? And in practice, that is sort of what happens, right? Except that, the controller, what it does is it performs a query, pulls data out of the model, and then just says, okay, use this view and render it. Okay. Which is why we sort of draw that part of the link as being directly from the model to the view. It's basically taking the data, taking the template, and giving both and saying, okay, render them and show it on the screen. Okay. So if you want to think of it as the controller still being the mediating entity, right? Something which is there between the two, that's also okay. It's not wrong, right? It's just that ultimately the controller in that second part is probably not doing very much. It's just sort of figuring out what kind of query to send to the model, pulling out the appropriate data and sending it to the view. Okay. If it does some additional logic in between, then yeah, you should probably think of it as the data is not going directly from the model to the view. It's going through the controller. But should you call that part a controller, or should you just call it some post-processing logic? See, this is why I'm saying, that rigidly sticking to MVC at that point can become problematic. The controller is useful as long as you think of the fact that anything going from the view to the model is an action. It is a controller. Think of the meaning of the word. It provides some kind of control. It allows you to tell you what the model should, what is required of the model. Should I retrieve data? Should I modify data? Should I delete data? All of that is what is being conveyed by the controller. Okay, so yeah, somebody had raised their hand. Let me just, Sarthak, I think. Go ahead.
Yeah. Good evening, Professor.
Yeah,
so my question is more conceptual in nature, not related to the quiz directly. You mentioned the Web 1, 2, 3 in the beginning of this session. And I am assuming that by Web 3, you meant the current trends towards metaverse, where companies are talking about an interoperable virtual reality space.
Yeah.
In my understanding, the Web 1 and 2 became interoperable because of organizations like IETF. Because as a private entity, I always try to make an app or a platform. I'm seeing both as a similar stuff, where my customers can't leave easily because there should be a high enough cost from transitioning out of my app. So from a private entity perspective, I'll always try to make my systems less interoperable. While the internet requires it to be interoperable, that's why IETF came for, and then played a major role. But I don't see anything from interoperability standpoint on IETF standards for metaverse. So in your experience, how do you see the Web3 becoming interoperable?
Okay, sorry, I have to say one thing. I mean, thanks for bringing it up. I have to say this, it might be a controversial answer, but I am not a fan of Web3. I think it is hype at this point, right? And yeah, I mean, sorry, I have to say that. Okay. At this point, I think Web3 is just way too much hype. I don't see anything over there that cannot be solved in better ways using other technologies. So having said that, there are a lot of intelligent people who are making cases for Web3. So I will probably sit and wait. I am not planning to, say that this is likely to happen. And to me, I think the point that you raised is one of the most important ones about why Web3 is problematic, right? People are going on saying about how Web3 allows you to have like interoperability and immutability of transactions and so on. But at the end of the day, I mean, even if you're talking about blockchain works only as long as there is a majority of, nodes on the chain that are sort of in agreement about something. And at the end of the day, the big corporations are going to have huge blockchains of their own. So how is this solving that problem? Of course, I'm hand waving over here, right? This is a very high level discussion. I don't want to get into the details of this right now, but I see problems over there in terms of how it is described now, at least, right? But I think the point that you raised, how do we sort of standardize things so that they are open, is crucial. And see, Web 1, in fact, was, I mean, there was hardly anything to it, right? It was just the HTTP protocol and the HTML definition, right? And that's great. I mean, that's pretty much all that was required at that point in order to, anybody could set up a server, right? Well, even today, anybody can set up a server because ultimately you just run Python -m http.server in a Linux box, and yes, you have a server running, right? That's probably the simplest way to get started right now. And if I know somebody else's IP address or their domain name, I can connect to another server. That was Web 1. And in fact, that was the original idea of hypertext. Web 2, things became dynamic, right? People figured out that they could actually build applications on top of this. But once again, exactly like you pointed out, when it really started taking off is after standardization really came into place. And in fact, it's not, in hindsight, it looks as though, yeah, things were standardized very nicely and so on. But if you go through that period, right, the early 2000s, it was like crazy. Microsoft was trying its best to introduce its own variations on HTML, on JavaScript. They had their own language. There was something else called Shockwave Flash. There was Microsoft's ActionScript, then Silverlight, a whole bunch of things, none of which were standardized. They would work as long as you were in that ecosystem, right? But why did it work out this way? I think at some point, the fact that multiple, and there were many things that played a part in why today's web is reasonably interoperable. Okay. And one of the major things is the fact that, Apple sort of took off in a big way with their mobiles and their iPads and their computers, all of which were not using Microsoft technology, but still needed to be handled. Then, of course, Google Chrome came along, right? And that became a sort of neutral browser that was supported by everyone. So in hindsight, it looks very nice that the IETF played a role in standardizing, but it's not, you go and look at the number of different standards that were created by the IETF that pretty much fell by the wayside, and you'll realize it was not as smooth as that sounds. So the IETF, I think, plays a very important role in finally giving a standard, but actually saying, okay, this is the standard and this is how we need to move forward on it. It might be a great technical standard, but people don't use it in spite of that, right? Because they have, exactly like you said, they have their vested interests, right? They want to sort of keep people using their system, which means they provide additions. It's not that they are just being malicious. They are actually providing extra facilities, but at the cost of interoperability. Okay. So yeah, to recap in terms of your question, Web 1 was pretty much an academic exercise, right? It all went along nicely and people were randomly adding tags here and there. Somewhere along the line, Web 2, once it took off, there were a lot of things that sort of exploded into existence at that point. But luckily, somewhere there, I think, people decided that JavaScript needed some kind of standardization, HTML needed some kind of standardization. And if you even look at, HTML, HTML3, HTML4, and finally HTML5, the reason why it is looking good is because it's a living standard, right? Is it an IETF standard? Well, that also went through a lot of ups and downs. There were some two different groups that were working on it. But eventually, at this point, we have something that is reasonably stable. So when you look at it from that point of view, I think something similar will happen with Web3, right? I mean, there are so many different blockchains, so many different implementations, so many different possibilities. I guess after a few years, some of them will win out, some of them will sort of fall by the wayside. And there is absolutely no guarantee that the one that will win will be the best one technically. It's unfortunate, but true. That's where it stands. Okay. So yeah, I don't know if that was a very pessimistic answer, but hopefully it gave some answer to your question.
A small follow-up.
Yeah, sure.
Are you aware of any standards in process of being formation for Web3?
Actually, I'm just not following it closely enough for that. So I'm not looking at it. But, I mean, as far as I know, it depends on this idea of blockchain. And unfortunately, blockchain itself is not standardized at this point, right? There are many different implementations. Yeah. So from that point of view, there will be people. The IETF, of course, is the final one that comes out with the RFCs, right? So those RFCs are a very powerful mechanism, ultimately, that it's very interesting. You look at it and, it's actually something called a request for comments, right? It's just asking people to give feedback. But ultimately, an RFC gets standardized, and that's what becomes a technical document. So each one of those, the HTTP protocol, all of those things have their own RFCs associated with them. Now, is there something similar happening for Web3? Quite likely. I have not followed it closely enough, so I don't know, actually.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Sure. Any other questions?
Sir, I had a question regarding the quiz on Sunday.
Sure.
So, as we have seen, the syllabus for for AppDev is pretty it's not really restricted like that thread which you posted for last term. It is a field which is always evolving, so there can be no set syllabus.
True. Yeah.
So the quizzes will have some I guess what I'm trying to ask is, will the quiz be based solely on what we have covered in live sessions, the lectures, or will there be some external components like something which we would come across while doing lab assignments, or something which we would know if we delved into the documentation of a particular program or something?
See, one sort of policy that we have been trying to maintain, and I can't guarantee that it is 100% implemented always, is that even if you have not, for example, come across a particular term before, right? Let's say that there was some particular usage in Jinja or something of that sort, which you might not have encountered before, but you have done some programming, and you are generally familiar with some programming concepts. For the most part, you should be able to work it out on your own, right? In other words, by sort of looking at what the question statement looks like and what is the context within which it is asked and so on, it should be possible for you to work it out sufficiently to at least say, okay, this is the most likely answer or something like that, right? Like I said, this is a bit subjective because there is a possibility that what I consider to be, reasonable experience of programming may not be what somebody else does. But this is something that, multiple people among us have sort of looked at these questions. We have sort of tried to iterate on that and keep that in place. A large part of the questions, of course, are pretty much straight meaning that, mostly focused on what was covered either in the lectures or in the live sessions or something like that. But if at all there is something which is not, and maybe something which you might not have come across in one of these sessions, it should be for the most part something that you can figure out given the context of the question.
Okay, so sir, what we have learned till now will basically act as an all-encompassing base for the quizzes, right?
Yes. Yes.
All right, sir.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Sure. So, I mean, I'm also open to general feedback. Are there any other questions, generally in terms of this? One of the things is even in terms of the students themselves, right? How many of you are working, or how many of you are have prior experience with application development? It would be interesting to sort of get feedback from those of you who have tried this. And why are you even doing the course, right? So all of those things are interesting. So just anything. Yeah, go ahead. Open mic.
Hello, sir.
Yes, go ahead.
Sir, I have a question related to quiz.
Yeah.
So I don't know the question is, I mean, a good question or not, but in the CS, I am totally from a non-CS background.
Okay.
And in the CSS, I see that the CSS is very vast, like so many things. Like in the if I see in the class and ID, this kind of thing. So various syntax like uh, dot plus and hash plus, this kind of things. So do we need to remember all the things? I mean, what happens in when we working on the lab assignment? So what I do is I just search that in Google and see the syntax and this kind of things and just do that. But in exam we need to we have to remember the concept. So how much we should remember only the basic class ID, this kind of things, only dot and has this, or the child and second child, this kind of various concepts was there, so like dot plus. So do we need to remember the second layer?
See, I
That is
can't give you like a exact thing saying, okay, you need to know this much or you don't need to know that much. Like I told you, I mean, what you said is exactly right. I mean, it has nothing to do with being from a CS or a non-CS background. What you said in terms of, okay, when you're actually writing code, you go look it up on Google or Stack Overflow and you go based on what is showing up over there. That's what I do. I mean, I have never written a Python program of more than like 5 lines so far, where I have not had to go and Google something. Okay. So, but having said that, like I said, some of these things, like some of the notation, right? We have to sort of assume that at least the basic familiarity of the notation in CSS is there. So because otherwise it becomes impossible to ask any kinds of questions also, right? Now, how much do you need to know? Unfortunately, I don't have a clear-cut answer for that, right? I can't really say, okay, this is enough or this is not enough. So yeah, sorry. I mean, it's not a good answer, I know, but yeah.
No, sir. I'm asking on the quiz point of view, not in
I
general
understand.
development point of view.
No, that's exactly
Like
what I'm
basic,
saying.
yeah.
From the quiz point of view, I can't give you a clear-cut answer and say, oh yeah, you need to know only this much, and we will make sure that that it's not there. In some cases, we do have to ask questions which sort of test a little bit more than just the very minimal CSS, because otherwise it becomes like only concepts in CSS, which is, there are not that many concepts that we can really ask, right? So the assumption is that since there have been these examples and things worked out code that we have given, we should be able to build on top of that for the quiz.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon, sir. You asked us our introduction. I was just about to introduce myself.
Sure. Yes. Yeah, good to know.
Sir, my name is Trivikram Manath. I am a working professional. I work in Larsen and Toubro Infotech.
Okay.
And I had joined this program simultaneously as I joined my first job.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I am doing this on the side. I've never really coded on websites per se before.
Okay.
So I'm having a lot of fun in this program, but just one suggestion and one feedback that the lab assignments, I'm like all the public cases are passing, but few private cases are not passing, and because of which getting
No, I understand that actually, that this whole business with the private versus public test cases is something that we have been discussing internally also.
Okay.
And yeah, I agree that it's not ideal. The current situation is not ideal. We are trying to see what's the best way to resolve this so that you don't feel unnecessarily penalized also.
Yes, sir, because at least if the public cases don't pass and it is very analogous to private, then we'll come to know
exactly
that we
no, I understand. I mean, even if I was submitting something, if it passed all the public test cases, I would assume that it's more or less okay. Yes, so yeah, unfortunately, it is something that we don't have a good solution for yet. It's definitely something we are working on. We'll look at it. Yeah.
Okay,
Thanks.
sir, great. Also, one more question, sir. I'm trying to make a website of my portfolio. Would you suggest some technologies that I should look upon, because I would like to do that, and I'm in a time crunch right now. I would like, because we are starting that internship process from IIT side. So
okay.
they have requested us to make a digital portfolio, and until week 4, I have studied and practiced and done all the assignments. But if you could just suggest, we could just look it up and try to do as soon as possible.
I see. Unfortunately, this is, and part of the problem over here is that this is a question that is highly subjective, right? I mean, it depends on aesthetics. So, and what you find to be a nice portfolio might be different from what somebody else wants, or what, finally the person who's looking at it might be expecting. AppDev 1, unfortunately, I'm not sure really gives you the right things for building something like a portfolio. It could help you put together a few apps or something of that sort. And to be very frank, having those on your portfolio, saying that you put together an app for this, or you developed an app to do something else, is, I think, good. It gives prospective employers something to look for, something that basically tells them that, okay, fine, this person didn't just sit through the course. They actually tried it out. They tried out some code. They have got some experience with it. They might not be from the background, an IT background or a CS background, but they have actually put in the effort to try and understand what is going on. And that ultimately, actually speaking, is what matters in this area, at least, right? Because AppDev is like completely application oriented. There are like relatively few concepts, but the concepts that are there, are, if you know them, then they're helpful in terms of how you go about designing apps. That's essentially it. But everything else is practice. You have to try things out in order to learn.
Okay.
Now, from the point of view of building something like a website, there are a lot of these things called static site generators, which, they use some kind of a mix of JavaScript on the front end and mostly a compiled version on the back end, which means that it takes in your data itself. Could be, instead of HTML, you could write it in something like Markdown or some other format, and it would compile it into HTML for you, right? So things like applying a uniform template or a layout across multiple pages, all of that can be done very nicely using these kind of static site generators, right? There are a whole lot of them. I mean, I think once I went and looked at it, and there were some 350 things that showed up. I think it's almost like, each person who hears about a static site generator decides to create one more of their own. Right? So the point is, at some level, I think what I would suggest is take one step back and think about, rather than making it very flashy and complicated, can you keep it simple but clear, that it sort of brings out what your strengths are, right? At the end of the day, that is going to impress a prospective employer more than say seeing something that looks fancy, but it doesn't really tell them anything about you.
Got it, sir. Got it, sir. Over the time, I'll improve it, obviously.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I mean, it's going to be a work in progress.
Yes.
So,
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. So one other thing, I mean, how many of you are active on Discourse? I mean, I hope that most of you are also taking advantage of the Discourse. I know that, there are other instructors, others, Sonal, Abhishek, all of them are very good with that. So yeah, good. Definitely make use of that, right? That's good to. So.
Sir, I'm not that active on Discourse, but I'm attend all the live sessions as much as I can.
Yeah, I mean, it's good. See, the reason I'm saying Discourse is because sometimes, myself and Tejesh, we sort of pop in on Discourse every now and then and take a look at that. And if there are any sort of interesting questions, we also try and participate in those discussions, right? Which is easier for us because we can do that at any time. Whereas finding the live sessions, it may not always be possible because it clashes with other lectures over here, or other commitments that we have. So the Discourse is an asynchronous way of doing things, right? You can ask questions at any point, and it's easier for us to answer at any point. So I think it's a good resource. Please, all of you should be aware of it and try and make use of it as much as possible. Go look at it. There are a lot of questions asked by other your fellow learners, and in some cases there are really good suggestions also that come up over there. So. All right. So, like I said, if there aren't any further questions, feel free at any point to bring up questions on Discourse, and, those discussions can carry on over there. Yeah. And others, if there is anything else, then yeah. Okay. There's a couple of questions. We can take those. Sure. Absolutely. I think Tushar Gupta can go ahead.
Sir, can you please provide some insight on project? Can you participate in team?
Sorry, what is that?
Sir, can you please provide some insight on project?
Yeah. Yeah, we haven't got the final project statement ready yet, but see, okay, broadly speaking, what it is going to involve is some kind of an application. We'll be asking you to develop some kind of an application that is trying to put together the concepts that you're learning in this course, right? So for example, how do you sort of approach the problem? How do you create the models, the views, and the controllers for it, right? Assuming that you are using the MVC approach, which hopefully you are, because that's what we are trying to look for. But more importantly, at the end of the day, we are planning to have this Viva around the project, which means that it's not just a question of, okay, you have a final submission. What we are also looking for is how well are you able to sort of explain what you have done in the project, and are you able to sort of add something to it, and how well do you understand what you have written so that you are then able to modify it if required. But conceptually, it will be some kind of an application that puts together the ideas that you have learned in this course and sort of builds upon them in order to build some kind of an application, right? And for the most part, what we are trying to do is to see if, rather than having something very fancy, we'll probably try and have something which is of immediate use to individual people, right? I mean, by writing this code, you might actually find it useful to either yourself or your friends or somebody you know, which hopefully will also, be a sort of incentive to try and write the code. But yeah, I think the formal problem statement and so on, we are working on it. We should be able to get it out reasonably soon.
Thank you, sir.
Next, Srijan Mehrudra.
I wanted to know how much.
Sorry, your voice was breaking up. Can you repeat that? Sorry, I'm unable to hear anything. Srijan.
Application, what would be like the estimated cost?
Actually, sorry, I missed the question completely. I think your voice became clear only now. Could you repeat that, or alternately, maybe type it up in the chat box if possible? Actually, I can't hear anything from your side right now. Not sure if. Okay. Maybe we'll just get back to Srijan later. Take the next question. Yes, Srijan. Hello. Hey, sorry, I'm not able to hear. No. Srijan, could you give it a try to maybe type it out in the chat? In the meanwhile, maybe Bhavya, if you can go ahead with your question.
Yeah, sir. My question was also based on the project. Is there a specific timeline that will be indicated for the project? I ask because in the guideline given for MAD1, it says that the project is expected to be submitted around, I think, mid-March.
Mid-March?
It's listed as either 13th or 18th March, I believe.
Oh, yeah. Okay, fine.
So, sir, the issue is I have exams from March beginnings, and I don't want that to interfere at all with my lab assignments and projects. So, is there a specific timeline, like a period of time which we will be given for development of the project? Like how much?
Yeah, actually, there is. I mean, in the sense that, we are trying to sort of specify that this would be roughly a 3 to 4 week project is what we have in mind. And this time around, we are also looking to see if we can have some kind of milestones that sort of guide you along the way or something. But yeah, roughly that is the duration. Let me just discuss this with the operations side as well to make sure that we understand what's happening. And I don't know if there are others also who have a similar constraint with time. Then at some point everyone will have some kind of constraints. You want the time to be shifted or something, but that won't always be possible. But if you have an exam that is clearly conflicting with it, we'll try and take that into account and see what's the alternative possibility that we can do. But this is a large course, so it's actually
of course, sir. I realize that it's not possible to change guidelines for the sake of one person.
Right. So we'll try and at least make sure that the question sort of comes early enough that hopefully you would be able to handle it without necessarily pushing it. And that's something we can try.
That's it, sir. Thank you so much.
Okay. Next, Sarthak. Unless she can.
Yeah, hi.
Yes.
This is more of a introductory thing. So I was a working professional before going back to grad school.
Okay.
I worked a couple of years in Microsoft, but not in a developer role. So actual development is new for me, especially from a web development perspective. I've led web dev teams for nonprofits.
Okay.
So the issue that I have seen in my experience is that we write code to be readable by a computer, right? So or else the test cases will fail.
Yeah.
But the code also has to be readable by humans, or else it can't be maintained. So
Yes.
as a feedback in this course, can we get some kind of suggestions on the readability of our project code
Okay.
for both MAD1 and the AppDev2,
Right.
and also an optional lecture or a live lecture to help students understand how to write more readable code. Because that's where even I struggle with, and that's the reason I'm strongly averse to JavaScript, because it's very difficult to write readable code on JavaScript. I'm coming from a strong type background, C, C++, Java. Python is also not strongly typed, but Python is very readable, at least in my opinion. So how to write that?
Correct. So I have a slightly different take on that. I'm not like a hardcore JavaScript fan or anything, but I feel that it's possible to write reasonably readable code in JavaScript. I have seen some examples of code that I actually found to be quite nice and readable. But I think the default is what you said. The default code that you get in JavaScript is an absolute nightmare. That is, impossible to read. Right. And that's partly because there are certain kinds of idioms, as they say, right? I mean, some standard coding styles that people come up with, which are like, actually speaking, just idiotic, okay, for want of a better word. They are like bad and should not be encouraged. But you are right. I mean, certain other languages probably are better at guiding you away from that kind of code and sort of forcing you to write slightly more readable code. Having said that, the readability is also a question of what you are familiar with to some extent, because I've actually read things by people who think that Lisp is a readable language, and to me that's like as bad as it gets, right? But then I look at the Lisp more carefully, and then sort of start looking at the structure of the program, and then yes, it suddenly starts making a lot more sense. But on the point that you raised is absolutely right. Readability is something that is very important, and how do we sort of do that? I don't have an immediate answer to it, but I think this is something which potentially we could even have something where maybe the peer review part of it could come into play, right? And is there any way that we could have things where maybe snippets of code are put out there and we get feedback from people saying, okay, this looks nice or this does not look nice, and it's clear what it does. But I mean, that's just an idea I'm thinking about now that you have put this there. But yeah, you're right. We don't have clear-cut guidelines on it right now. It is something that we'll think about. We'll see if we can bring in some parts of it. So yeah, thanks for the feedback. Good idea.
Further suggestion for peer review in particular, it didn't work very well for stats 2. So I would suggest having marks on both sides, the reviewer and the submitter. Because as a developer, I have to read other people's code, especially in open source model. So if I'm able to read and understand that code, I get some points, because that's how I'm supposed to be trained. And also on the other side, the person who is able to write better code, so that more people are able to read it. So there is incentive on both sides to be able to communicate through code, and wherever this relationship works better, those people get better points.
Okay, yeah, that is an interesting way of putting it. Okay. Yeah, I think, I mean, the problem is, it is like tricky at this point. I don't want to associate it with marks in the course, but there has to be some kind of incentive. Otherwise, people won't even bother to do it. So, but yeah, I think there are a few ideas over here that are worth following up. So definitely, I think we'll go further on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the feedback. Yes, next, Chaitanya.
Hello, good afternoon, sir.
Yeah, good afternoon.
My doubt is regarding where does JavaScript come into picture, because we're using Python to render HTML codes and use HTML. So where does JavaScript come into picture, or better way to frame it is, does Python completely overtake JavaScript for coding app dev files?
JavaScript comes in AppDev too. Okay, that's the short answer. Now, but if if you take a step back and think about in an actual application development concept, right? See, Python cannot replace JavaScript for the simple reason that Python runs only on the server. It does not run on the client. It does not run on your browser, right? So JavaScript becomes essential when you want something which is going to be user interactive, meaning that it actually is able to interact with the user and give a good user experience by directly doing some computation on the browser side itself, right? So if you, I mean, as we look at in AppDev 2, but even, you might have looked at other websites and you might have seen some concepts over here where essentially what happens is that the JavaScript is used in order to render a nice front end. Okay, that's one part of it. But even if it's not a fancy front end, the more important thing it's doing is that part of the computation happens there inside the browser, and only the required elements that need to go back and come back from the server are fetched using JavaScript. So it sort of helps you to streamline that whole process of the communication between the server and the client. It also helps you to offload a lot of the processing onto the client side. It sort of helps with cleaning up a lot of things there. And because Python can't run on the browser, Python can't be used for this. So essentially, as of now, JavaScript is the only language that can actually run on the browser side. Of course, there is also WebAssembly, right? WASM, which is a sort of compiled version of JavaScript in some sense. But that's essentially the limitation that you are going to face.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes, Pushpak.
So you said that Python cannot be, Python cannot overtake JavaScript because it cannot run on the browser. So let's say
No, that's just to clarify, I mean, that's not really the term that I used. I wouldn't say overtake JavaScript or anything of that sort. I'm not talking about which one will become more popular. I'm just talking about it cannot replace JavaScript on the browser. That's all.
So like if some company launches a product, a web browser, which can actually run Python on the browser, on the client side.
Yeah.
So what are your views on that?
It's already been done. It won't work.
Okay.
Right. I mean, there are people who have done Python, they have done Haskell, they have done various kinds of languages running directly on the browser. Now, the reason I'm saying it won't work is because people are not using a browser because it runs a particular language. They are using it because it allows them to access the websites that they want to. Right. So unless that company also goes and translates every single website, right? Amazon and whatever, Google and Gmail and Google Drive and every single one of those things to work with that Python based code, people will still use Chrome or the equivalent, because that is the one where all of those applications work. Okay. Now, the bigger question is why, right? And why should they even bother with running Python on the browser? Because Python is not a great language in terms of speed, right? It's just that it's good to program. And if you look at it from that point of view, actually, there are better solutions because you can actually write Python code and there are compilers that will convert it into JavaScript. Okay. So if you wanted to code in Python, you can actually develop your apps in Python, compile them into JavaScript, and then run them on the browser. And in fact, not just Python, there is, in fact, there's a project called Mscripten. I think I mentioned it in one of the later lectures in AppDev 1. Mscripten basically can take C or C++ code and convert it into JavaScript. So you can actually develop an app in C and then finally run it on your browser. There is also things like this Rust language has a WebAssembly target, Rust, Go, even C. Most of them have what are called WebAssembly targets, which means they can be compiled into WebAssembly, and then that will run on the browser. So you don't actually need to run the language. The browser doesn't need to support the language. You can develop in whatever language you want and compile it to JavaScript or WebAssembly so that it runs on the browser. Okay. So yeah, hope that answered your question. Yes, Yash Srivastava. Not getting any audio. Yash Srivastava. Hello. Yes, Yash, your voice is very faint, but yeah, could you speak a little louder?
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Yash.
Yeah, good afternoon.
Sir, I am really new to development and programming. Hello.
Huh?
Sir,
Okay.
I am really new to development and programming, and one thing that hello
Yes, go ahead.
that I have seen is that most of the as I have served on Google, sir, as much as I have seen on like uh, uh, hello.
Hello. Yeah,
Uh,
I can.
Sir,
Your
my
voice
question
is
is that
clear.
as far
Yeah.
as I've seen that on Google and all that, most of the companies emphasize more on software competitive programming over software development. Sir, why is that?
I'm not sure I understand the question. What do you mean by competitive programming over software
Uh,
development?
Sir, like when they hire freshers, then they
So they prefer DSA, like
Yeah,
the
but that
freshers.
depends. Okay, so two parts to it, right? One is it depends on the target profile. So if you are looking at a job profile that specifically involves application development, then possibly they might consider a person with a background in application development. But having said that, even if you ask me, I would probably say that DSA is probably the more important course for a simple reason, because the application development is giving you the technologies or concepts that are there in order to sort of uh, build an application of your own. But what is the logic that runs behind the scenes? Is that logic being implemented efficiently? Are the data structures that you are using things that can scale to large numbers of people, right? See, at the end of the day, even any application development that we are doing, right, part of it might be when you are just interested in building an app for your own use, which is fine, then it's not really a problem. But let's say that you start scaling and you want to sort of share it with your friends, then with their friends, and it starts going like 100,000, 10,000, you hit a lakh of users. At that point you start seeing performance problems, you run into memory issues, you run into speed issues, all of those, unless your architecture is designed well, right? Unless your internal data structures, you have put things together properly in such a way that the searching can happen efficiently. Those are things that become more important at that scale. So from the point of view of a person who is sort of going deeper and who is interested in application development, but ultimately is interested in having something that can scale to a large number of users, those are technologies you absolutely need to understand. You need to have that background. Now, competitive programming is a different story. I mean, I'm not. I think there is some value to it, because it forces you to try and understand some of the things that are involved in writing code that runs fast or efficiently or even correctly. Okay, so from that point of view, I would say that yeah, some amount of competitive programming I think is good, but sort of looking only for the top people, that you have to get like such and such scores in competitive programming, I think that misses the point. And I don't think companies do that either. They sort of look for, okay, do you have that background, just to sort of see whether you have enough programming experience in some sense, right? Because to become good at competitive programming, you have to write a lot of code, and that is more useful than anything else. Okay. So yeah, I mean, no, that's one thing I would suggest you also need to keep in mind from the point of view of a course like this. You are doing a course on app dev, but is it the most important course in your portfolio, from whichever way you want to look at it, right? I mean, I would not say so. I think this is a good skill to have, but unless you also have your strengths in other areas, that is, I mean, strengths meaning you at least need to build up confidence in other areas like DSA and databases and things of that sort, then you will be able to sort of present a much more rounded view, right? A well-rounded view, and to a prospective employer, to tell them that yes, I mean, it's not just that you know how to build an app, but you also know how to build it well. Okay, so yeah, I hope that answered your question.
yes, thank you, sir.
Sure. Yeah, is there a question, Anirudh? can see the mic, but can't hear anything.
Hello.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, sir. So the Srijan could not ask his question before, so he has asked his question on the chat.
Oh, sure. Okay, I didn't
Yeah,
see it.
so
in the
how
chat,
much
but yeah.
does it cost to build an entire application like Swiggy or Instagram or Zomato?
That's actually a good question. I don't have a good answer for that, but that was one of the things at some point we were hoping to bring in. I'm not sure whether at some we might even try and see how to bring part of that into. See, what are the things involved in when you say to build an app? The cost involved in building an app. So the question becomes, what do you mean by cost? Are you talking about developer cost, meaning that the number of people who are involved in developing something, or are you talking about hardware costs, right? Hardware and infrastructure costs. Okay. Now, as far as developer cost is concerned, now mostly I think for the good apps that are over there, right? I mean, the ones that are like really seeing a large number of users, you'll find that there is either some kind of a balance, or in general, the developer cost should be more than the infrastructure cost. Okay. And what I mean by that is, if you are paying more for your infrastructure than you are paying to your developers, it probably means that it might be worth, either getting more developers or getting a more experienced developer to see if they can bring down infrastructure costs, right? And infrastructure, on the other hand, nowadays, a lot of people would be using either AWS, Amazon, or Google Compute, right? I mean, GCP or Google Cloud Platform. Now, let's say that you take up something like Google Cloud or Google App Engine, then there are ways in which they can scale very nicely, right? You can write a small application and then sort of host it on Google in such a way that it can, as and when the number of requests increases, it actually creates more instances so that they can handle more requests. Okay. Now, the point is, all of those need to be done carefully. They require you to think about those things. Can your application scale in the first place, right? Can you have like multiple front ends? All of that is possible only if your database can fundamentally handle multiple queries coming in parallel, right? So it doesn't matter if you have like 10 front ends, but there is only one database and that becomes the bottleneck. Then the question becomes, how do you parallelize or scale your database, right? So lots of questions of that sort need to be answered. So I think the question you ask is actually a good one. I think we'll try and find out a bit more if we can get numbers from some people. Unfortunately, the problem is most companies would not be interested in revealing raw numbers, right? But at least if we can get, we'll try and find out a bit more information about things like the number of requests per second and things like that they have. I think in one of the earlier lectures, I had mentioned something about Google itself, right? Google search, what kind of the number of requests per second that they hit and so on. There are ways of sort of estimating things like that, but it's ultimately quite difficult. So yeah, I think there's something in the chat over there, high scalability. Yeah, I mean, exactly. So I think, like you said, it is a 10-year-old article, right? They're talking about like 9 million users. I have not read this article, but I think, these are worth looking at. The problem is in most companies are sort of reluctant to give out this information because at the end of the day, it could be that a competitor is going to sort of point out and say, oh, they can actually sort of understand a lot about your system architecture just from the kind of information you give about how it scales. Right? But how much does it cost is a very difficult question to answer. It's like highly application dependent. Right? One of the things, of course, you will notice is as you go to really high-end applications with large number of requests per second and so on, it's unlikely that it will still be working with something like Python or JavaScript. I mean, it could be, but it's unlikely. And the reason I say unlikely is because at that point, the fact that Python and JavaScript are interpreted languages, right? The overhead over there becomes fairly large. and you probably need to go for a compiled language like Golang or C++ even, or and a lot of people, of course, use Java. But there are some of these things like Golang and Rust and so on that are even more sort of specific towards those kind of high-end applications. But that's in terms of optimizing. But how do you answer in general? How do you estimate what kind of costs you are going to face? You need to do a lot of and ultimately it comes from experience, but you can do based on how many users do you expect, how many requests per second, how many page loads, what kind of information is transferred on each page. Based on that, you could sort of come up with things of how you might scale, but it would depend. It would be very application dependent. Okay. So I hope that answered your question. Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
So, but only a single person cannot able to make a Swiggy type application. So it needs an entire team, I think.
See, a Swiggy type application a single person can make. Okay. Now, meaning that I can actually, have something which basically collects information from various restaurants, takes care of creating the database over there, then creates the front end. All of that could actually be done by a single person. Where you need a team is because there are the database itself is like rapidly changing, right? I mean, there are requests coming in from people. It's like how does the database scale? How does it become bigger? All of that is one issue, right? Apart from that, you need to actually interact with the restaurants so that you get their menus, you get all their items. You need to have another sort of non-technical team that is keeping track of all of that. They might not be coders, but there will be one big team which is just responsible for interfacing with the restaurants, making sure that their thing is up to date. Then there are like a whole bunch of other things involved with the people, right? I mean, there are the actual delivery agents who are working with Swiggy, who their payroll has to be maintained, their assignments have to be given. So from that point of view, an app like Swiggy is not just about the app. The app is the smallest part of it in some sense, right? I mean, the code itself, although the code might be big, but the code is relatively speaking one of the smaller parts of your entire system. Getting the actual data, keeping it live, keeping it up to date, all of that is as hard, and not as hard. It's much harder than actually developing the app. Okay. Yeah, so from that point of view, can a single person develop an app like Swiggy? I would say not easy, but yes, you could do it. But again, over there, it makes sense to have a team because there will be continuous change requests, right? There will be some kind of a feature that somebody wants to add, somebody wants to put in a premium thing, somebody wants to make a change at the last minute. Your marketing team wants some other changes done over here. If all of that comes and lands on one person's head, then they're basically going to, run screaming and say that's the end of the app. So that is where teams come in. But is it fundamentally required that you need a large team in order to develop an app simply because 100 million users are using it? No, not necessarily. You need a large team to maintain and operate the app, not necessarily to create it in the first place. Yes, Sarthak.
A follow up to the same question. You mentioned that it is not possible to understand the scalability and the budgeting from a private player, but even government has websites like, let's say, IRCTC, etc., or Arogya Setu. So is it possible to understand from their examples how to budget for the man hours or the money to launch such an application at a certain scale?
It's interesting. I mean, I would I can try and see if there are instances where we can find out more about it. Yeah, I know that our director, for example, was involved with the Arogya Setu app. You might know the teams behind the development and so on. But you have to keep in mind one thing, that the constraints that government deployment is working under are actually somewhat different from what a private company would do, right? For a private company, they are interested in various things like, okay, it has to go out, get out to market as soon as possible. It has to be well maintained, lots of things of that sort. Whereas in a government thing, there are other constraints in terms of who you can hire, what kind of salaries, even things of that sort also come into play over there. right? So it would be a different set of people that you would probably get. Now, having said that, in the government case, I think they mostly sort of outsource this through some other company who has more experience in development. I'm not sure NIC developed this app directly. I don't think so. But yeah, there would be somebody with some kind of experience. Getting this data, I think it's a very good question. It's definitely something that, we'll try and collect more information about. But yeah, I don't have good raw data to work with right now.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think there's a note in the chat also, right? I mean, around less than 20 engineers launched WhatsApp. Yeah, I mean, if you go by the story, Mark Zuckerberg is supposed to have launched Facebook all by himself, right? I mean, it's a different matter that I'm not entirely convinced about the quality of Facebook code, but now they are, for example, doing something on a totally different scale, right? Facebook has given rise to technologies that are like really, really good. I mean, all of React, Redux, all of those come from Facebook. There's a lot of like even hardware innovation that comes from Facebook. Now, why did all this happen? Because Facebook, once it started growing, they needed to maintain larger data centers. Due to the sheer number of users, you can't do it with like a small number of computers, right? You can sort of do the math there, right? I mean, if you have like 1 billion users, each user's database itself is going to be like, in the region of kilobytes, right? So we're talking about like terabytes of data just for the user data. And of course, you can store a terabyte of data on a single hard disk on one computer. But then just think of what happens when like 100 million users are making requests to a server, right? If you have even 100 megabits per second or 1 gigabit per second network pipe, how many requests can you handle on that network connection, right? So because of that, there are fundamental reasons why you need to start scaling out, right? You need to have more machines. You can't have all of them in one geographical location. You need to have them maintained across multiple places. Now, what that means is you need to start synchronizing, right? Because let's say I add a friend over here in one place, and in the US, somebody doesn't know that I have added so and so as a friend. That can't be. I need to synchronize between the servers in India and in the US so that both are showing me the same viewpoint. Okay. So when you start scaling like that, you can no longer do it with like a handful of engineers. You need to have like big teams. There are people who specialize in the hardware. There are people who specialize in the database management. There are people who specialize in synchronization, network activity, the network infrastructure, right? So you have thousands of engineers coming into it automatically. And then, of course, right now, Facebook, for example, spends, a significant number of their really top end engineers are working on things like Facebook AI, right? The AI branches, which are like either trying to find patterns in things or find out things like fake news. So if you ask, why does Facebook have thousands of engineers? They're not all sitting there and writing code for the front end, right? In fact, probably very few people are doing that. That front end is reasonably stable. It just remains as it is. But there are people who are maintaining like huge other code bases and also developing new things. So that is why we end up with this kind of number today. Okay, so all right, yeah, I think it's already past 3:30 at this point. So thanks everyone. It was a nice interaction session. And like I said, feel free at any point to bring up more questions on discourse. That's probably the best place to put it because there will be multiple people looking at it who can give you answers on that. And the other course instructors also usually are monitoring this. So if there is something that requires a specific answer from me or from Tejesh, then they'll let us know as well in case we haven't seen it ourselves. Yeah, all the best for the quiz, and please, hope you enjoy the course. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining the session. And yeah, we will be also planning to have such sessions in the future.